Today's occurrence happened in Antarctica, when three divers decided they were going to pull off something that had never been tried before, diving inside of an iceberg. They knew there would be some things that could happen that they just couldn't expect. But what they never expected was being sucked inside in a way that would later be described as horror story material. I'm Tatiana, and this is the story of the first ever iceberg cave divers. Caves have always fascinated Jill Heinerth, where most other people look at a cave and are immediately claustrophobic and filled with dread, with the internal dialogue to match. Jill is the opposite. Instead of going absolutely not, she goes absolutely. Jill wants to know what's around the corner you can't see past and beyond where light can't reach. She's an underwater filmmaker and professional cave diver. And for her, swimming through caves is like swimming through the veins of Mother Earth. She worked for the BBC and PBS, but at the time of this story, she worked for National Geographic. Jill and her partner had been watching satellite photos of a crack slowly opening up in the Ross Ice Shelf in Antarctica and wanted to pitch a project to National Geographic to go travel to Antarctica and see it. But during the time period they were preparing the pitch to go see that, an iceberg the size of Jamaica broke away from Antarctica. Jill and her partner knew when they saw that huge iceberg break off that their new pitch would be to dive that iceberg and to be the first people ever to cave dive inside of an iceberg. Now, when they pitched this idea, one of the first questions asked to them was, "There are caves inside of icebergs?" And Jill was like, of course there are caves in icebergs, even though she didn't actually know if that was true or not. It was just a hypothesis that they had. They knew there was a crack from where the piece broke off of the ice sheet and just assumed that there had to be other cracks to explore inside as well. But they ended up getting project approval, and Jill Heinerth, Wes Skiles, who goes by Wes, and Paul Heinerth went out to Antarctica to dive this iceberg. When Jill saw the huge iceberg for the first time, her heart raced. She was stunned by how beautiful it was, but she also felt extremely privileged because she was looking at something that was endangered and would never be the same again. Now, Jill was understandably nervous for this dive. They would be the first people ever to do something like that, but Jill was more nervous for Wes and Paul than she was for herself. It wasn't her first ice dive, but it was theirs, making it the coldest dive Paul or Wes would have ever done to that point. The other two weren't exactly new to diving. Wes had started diving when he was just 8 or 13 years old, depending on reporting, but this level of cold would be new to them. When they were suited up, they got close to an iceberg that they named Patience Camp, and they pulled their boat into a small bay. Wes got off the boat and into the water, and water started flooding his suit, but he didn't care. He was there to get footage of this historic dive, and he wanted to get at least 1 minute of it really quick, just to see how his new camera would perform. By the time he got 1 minute's worth of footage, he was nearly incapacitated and pretty much wearing a bag of freezing ice water. Jill and Paul had to try and push Wes back up into the boat, and Matt, the first mate on board, was pulling Wes in from above. They rushed to get the smaller boat they were on back to the Braveheart, which I believe was a larger boat or the main vessel that they used to travel there, before stripping Wes down and getting him inside of sleeping bags and in a bunk to try and raise his body temperature, because he had been in the water too long. Jill and Paul were okay because their suits were properly sealed, they were in the right equipment, still cold, but with proper safety measures, they weren't in immediate danger like Wes was. Now, water at just 69 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit or 21 Celsius is cold enough to kill you, which isn't that cold, but it is for your body. There's the obvious hypothermia, but there's also something called cold shock response, which can make you drown in an instant. Have you ever gotten into a cold shower or an ice bath or something and you've involuntarily gasped? That's a natural and common response. If you fall into cold water, a frozen lake, or even water less than 70 degrees in temperature, it can shock your body, make you gasp underwater so you start choking, probably panic, sink even further into even colder, deeper water. Your body goes into shock, so frantic movements are stopped because you're momentarily stunned by the cold water, and it causes you to sink like a rock. If the cold shock response doesn't kill you in the first minute, within 10 minutes, your limbs start to become incapacitated. Even strong swimmers have an extremely hard time, if not completely impossible time, trying to get back to the surface or onto a boat or to help. And within an hour, if you're still alive, depending on the temperature of the water at that point, hypothermia sets in. Now, imagine that in -4 degrees Fahrenheit or -20 degrees Celsius iceberg water. That's basically what Wes let into his suit. Jill, Wes, and Paul were all said to be experienced cave divers. And Jill even said that she was familiar with everything that could go wrong with their gear because of just how cold the water was, added on top of the fact that they were ice diving. The cold temperature makes their breathing equipment more likely to have issues or malfunction, among other things. But Jill said she didn't realize what they were actually getting themselves into because they were still going to dive inside of the iceberg. Wes and the first mate would stay on the boat after that little debacle, and Paul and Jill would go dive. The first thing Jill felt upon getting back into the water was like a brain freeze, but to her face from the water hitting her. She had to take a few fast breaths to adjust to the cold while she dropped her face underwater into the slushy mix of fresh and salt water. It's so cold, it's nearly impossible to focus, but she managed to push that aside and swim down through the chunks of ice and into this deep vertical fissure crack. Paul joined her and they descended into darkness until they were at the seafloor, about 130 feet or 40 meters deep. Now, being this deep was deeper than they had actually planned to dive while they were in Antarctica, but they didn't know where the seafloor was on this first dive. It was basically at the cusp of depth as far as where they wanted to be working in such a close environment, because deep dives require a longer time to slowly ascend. But when Jill turned to her right, she saw a passage that she knew led to an environment no one had been to before, and so they went through it. Going inside, they were surrounded by all shades of blue, white, and clear in the ice, and on the seafloor was this sharp contrast of yellow, orange, and red. On that sunset-colored floor, there were little Christmas tree-shaped worms, sponges, and things that looked like small palm trees moving with the current, filter-feeding organisms. And then, like something out of a horror movie, these spider lobster-looking creatures called isopods started raining down from the cracks over their heads and landing on Jill's camera that she wore, her head, her shoulders, and they were coming from all over the place and even crawling along the seafloor. Jill and Paul decided to keep swimming deeper into the iceberg, though, and as they continued, they could hear the ice cracking and popping as it moved and shifted. The seafloor sounded almost like pop rocks with its constant clicking, and then they heard a vibration that was so deep that they felt it in their bodies. Hearing and feeling that super loud vibration, Jill and Paul looked at each other, then their equipment, but everything seemed fine. So they kept going for a little bit before deciding to turn around and leave. When they made it back to the entrance that they came in from, the doorway that they used to get into that passage was gone. Seeing it closed, Jill immediately thought about how the water she was breathing had a number on it. It wasn't unlimited air like if she was above water. She only had so much air in the tanks she carried, and she had to use whatever she had left inside to help her and Paul get out, or else those breaths would just be bringing her closer to death. The pair searched for a way around the ice, and slowly but surely, they did manage to find a way out of that passage. As they ascended, they had to do a decompression stop at about 20 feet deep. Decompression stops are essential in some dives so that divers can safely release nitrogen or other inert gases that have dissolved in their body tissues during a dive. It's crucial to prevent decompression sickness or the bends. Decompression stops are usually known to be used after reaching a certain depth, after being underwater a certain amount of time, or if you're doing multiple dives close together, even if those dives are shallow dives. And the risk increases in cold or ice water. Colder temperatures cause peripheral blood vessels to constrict, so blood flow is reduced to the extremities, which can affect eliminating inert gases like nitrogen from the body while ascending, which increases the risk of decompression sickness. There are things like heating vests to provide external heat to divers, but research suggests that excessive use of heating sources at depth may increase the amount of inert gases a diver's body absorbs. And not using heating sources during the ascent may cause the diver to cool down and decrease the body actually releasing the gases that it needs to. Both of those conditions together can lead to an increased risk of decompression sickness. So it's suggested that divers follow conservative dive profiles and allow for slower ascents while incorporating safety stops to reduce the risk of the bends. When Jill and Paul finally made it to the surface, they saw Wes and Matt celebrating. And Wes and Matt told them that they were so excited because they thought Jill and Paul were dead. When Jill and Paul heard and felt that huge vibration, it was the iceberg calving. That big piece of ice that shed closed the entryway, and that's what trapped them inside temporarily. But on the surface, it caused a huge wave that almost flipped the boat that Wes and Matt were on, and it scared the daylights out of them. And after they realized they wouldn't die up on the surface, they were stuck waiting to see if Jill and Paul were okay, if they were alive. They couldn't put together a rescue operation. All they could do was wait. Day 1's dive attempt was successful. Everyone survived. So the next day, they decided to try again. When Jill went back down, the entrance seemed fine this time, so she and Paul descended quickly to the bottom to take photos of sea life. As they were taking photos, Jill noticed that the current was getting a bit stronger, little by little, and then all of a sudden, the current was just pushing Jill forward hard. Jill had to dig her hands into the seafloor to keep from being tossed, and her body did like this cartwheel sort of thing around her hand. Paul and Jill turned back towards the exit, but the current was too strong for them to move against it and for them to actually go anywhere. Not moving anywhere, they made eye contact with each other and knew the current had them. They were being sucked inside of the iceberg. They could see a blue light in the distance and figured it was another exit. In a snap decision, they chose to let go of what they were holding onto and go with the current towards the other doorway. As they went with the water, they kept going and going and going, and the light they saw didn't appear to be getting any bigger. They started to get nervous because before they let go, they honestly couldn't really tell how far that blue light that they thought was a possible exit was from them. Sensing distance inside of an iceberg for anything at all seemed like an impossible task. You're surrounded by ice, and everything's kind of warped. As clear as the water may be, discerning distance is not an easy task. And it felt like they were being pushed by the current for forever before they finally made it to the doorway. And when they did, they thought for sure that they were good and they made it out of the iceberg. But when Jill's head broke through the surface of the water, she was still surrounded by ice, and she couldn't see over or around it, and the boat was nowhere in sight. The possibility that she might die warped things for her. Her heart was in her stomach, and time felt compressed to the point where she lost all sense of time. Her and Paul were there, lost for what could have been 15 minutes, could have been half an hour. Jill didn't know, but she was getting cold and she was shaking. After however long, though, she heard something. It was the sound of the boat anchor being pulled up to be reset. The same current that pushed them through the iceberg pushed the boat and knocked it off its anchorage. The chain being yanked up and onto the boat is what Jill was hearing, and when the anchor was up, the boat moved. And it moved just enough for Jill to put together what she was hearing and to see a little peek of the boat around the edge of the iceberg. Jill yelled to Paul that she could see their boat, and then she heard Wes's voice in the distance asking if he just heard Jill's voice. Then Wes spotted them on the horizon and started moving the boat towards them before finally getting them out of the water. And would you believe me if I said that was not their last dive into that iceberg? Jill and Paul decided to do one more dive into the iceberg. But this time, Wes would join them, recovered from his ice plunge a day or two earlier. Wes decided to join because after reviewing the pictures that Jill and Paul took from their previous dive and seeing just how good they were, Wes wanted to shoot on the new camera since it was the best. Jill thought taking these risks really mattered for humanity's understanding of the planet and the changes we face moving forward. This happened in 2001, very 2001 coded given the technology advancements happening around that time and the talk of climate change. So all three of them descended to the seafloor on this next dive and went inside the iceberg, and even quicker than it happened last time, the current picked up. Feeling this and wanting to avoid a repeat of the last time, Jill turned to Paul and Wes and signaled to them that it was time to go. But when they turned around to leave, they realized that they might not be able to actually get out because of the current. They dug their hands into the seafloor and tried to pull themselves using the ground towards the entrance, but it wasn't working. The current pushed against Jill's efforts so powerfully that her forearms, her biceps, her triceps, like every single arm muscle in her body, was shaking from the strain. It took all of her energy to try and get back to the crevasse. Paul was behind her and Wes was behind him. Wes was losing more ground than the other two, though, as he pulled up the rear since he was fumbling with the camera, too. That's when Jill heard Wes yell out for someone to help him with the camera, which of course immediately made Jill angrily think, F the camera, we might die. But Paul fell back to help Wes, which made her mad at him, too, because they shouldn't be bothering with that during this life-threatening time. But the pair managed to work together to get to the entrance behind Jill. But there wasn't a way for all three of them to make their way back up the crevasse. Every time they tried to move up, the current just pushed them back down. They didn't want to let the current sweep them back through the iceberg again, realizing it wasn't the best idea. But Jill now had a hole in her glove, probably from digging her hands into the seafloor to pull herself along. So now she had a leak in her glove that was starting to paralyze her hand because it was so cold, and she lost feeling in it pretty soon after. So Jill quickly thought of how they could climb up the ice because they couldn't just climb up. It's ice, it's slippery, and they slipped down just trying to touch it. But then Jill remembered the sea life they observed while they were in there. She remembered seeing these small ice fish that were about the size of her thumb and seeing them live in these small burrows inside the ice. And it made her think about trying to just stuff her finger in those holes to see if she could grip enough to pull up to the next burrow, and so on and so forth. They'd basically have to finger climb for 130 feet, but if it worked, it could save their lives. So that's what they did. Inch by inch, they used the small burrows to climb up and out of the crevasse and away from the current inside of the iceberg. Jill led the way. Paul and Wes followed. They had to tuck their bodies and push against the current. They had to stop and let their bodies get reacclimated and find places where they could tuck in and hide against the current. But because they would stop moving to do that and be still, it was miserably cold. It's colder than ice cubes freezing in your refrigerator because salt water has to be colder to freeze. When they made it back to the boat, everyone on board was relieved to see them. Jill, Paul, and Wes were 2 hours past when they were supposed to have returned. A 1-hour dive turned into 3 because of how long they had to battle the current to the surface. And even though it seems like every trip having to do with iceberg cave diving ended with one or all of them near death, and that Jill clearly told someone on the boat that the cave tried to keep them permanently, they decided to still do one more dive after that. They got their equipment ready to be used the moment the current let up and had a meal while they were planning their next dive. While they were sitting around eating and planning, they heard screams from the boat deck. The trio immediately ran up to the deck and saw their iceberg, the one that they were just inside of, splitting into pieces that caused huge waves to hit their boat. Approximately 1 square mile of ice that they were just diving inside of not even hours earlier and were planning to go back inside of again was breaking into pieces and literally dissolving into the ocean. And Jill watched the scene, possibly with her mouth hanging open, just shook to her core because she realized in that moment that if they had been in the water at that time, they would be dead. Now, I know you're more than likely thinking something along the lines of, well, why in the world did they keep going back inside of it repeatedly like they didn't almost die every single time? Or something more harsh, well, they got lucky because they sure are idiots. And you aren't alone. Jill would say that anytime she told this story to anyone when they made it back home, people would pretty much say that exact same thing to her. But to her, it was worth it. Being able to document and experience a place that it was likely no one would ever see again is what she lives for. Looking back, she realized a few things. One of them being she should have noticed something was wrong when she noticed filter-feeding organisms on the seafloor. She would say that she should have paid attention immediately once she saw them because the current was strong, and the current brought food to those stationary animals that were anchored tightly into the seafloor. It should have been one of those light bulb goes off moments because everything was anchored there because it needed to be. The other was about the currents. While it was impossible to consider ahead of time, in hindsight, the currents weren't coming from out of nowhere. The weird currents and turnovers were there because of the difference in densities between freshwater and saltwater. The iceberg water is freshwater, and the ocean water is saltwater. They have different densities and rapidly turn over on each other as the iceberg moves throughout the ocean, causing the currents. So at times, they would be swimming close to the ice, and then they would be suddenly sucked downward in what really felt like this chaotic adapt or dive environment. Jill knew what she did was important. It was important for them to go and document that environment and all the living organisms in and around it, and she was glad to have those near-death experiences. It made her a safer and better diver going forward. Today, the list of her cave diving friends that have died is well over 100 people long. Wes is among those. According to reports, he died while diving off of Boynton Beach, Florida on July 21st, 2010, while filming underwater for National Geographic near Boynton Beach Inlet. The Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office in West Palm Beach, Florida said the other divers he was with said that Wes signaled to one of them that he needed to ascend to the surface because he had run out of film. He was there to film stuff, as per usual. The other divers continued working and didn't maintain a visual as Wes ascended. When the other divers decided to ascend a few minutes after that, they noticed Wes's body lying motionless near coral reefs on the ocean floor. They quickly brought him to the surface and administered CPR, and after that, Wes was taken to a hospital via ambulance where he was pronounced dead. The medical center he was taken to was reportedly not the closest, but it was the only one in the county with a decompression chamber, which Wes and the other divers would have needed to be treated with due to how rapidly they ascended trying to get Wes to the surface. The other divers were sent there to be treated as a precaution. It's believed that Wes wasn't taken by the county's emergency helicopter because it doesn't usually transport people who don't have a pulse. Obviously, the people treating him couldn't really comment on what happened with him, HIPAA and all, so they couldn't confirm or deny if Wes was in cardiac arrest when he was taken to the hospital. The only reason I mention that is because someone who knew Wes for 15 years mentioned that Wes wasn't the type to panic in a distressing situation, and he also mentioned that Wes's father died of a heart attack when he was around Wes's age, and that heart disease and heart problems kind of run in the family. So it's possible it was more of a natural cause of death rather than being because of diving. I don't know for certain either way, but a few things were revealed after his passing that make it a little murky. I'll get to that in just a second. Wes was 52 when he died. After his passing, his story was on the cover of National Geographic's August issue, and the State Parks Division of the Florida Department of Environmental Protection renamed Peacock Springs Park in West. So now it's called Wes Skiles Peacock Springs Park. Wes left behind a wife named Terry and their 2 children. In 2016, his widow, Terry, filed a lawsuit claiming that rebreather equipment malfunctioned, and that's what caused Wes's death. She claimed that the company that made the rebreather he used never did appropriate tests to determine if it was safe. A rebreather is a device that divers use that recirculates the exhaled air while they're diving, and it holds up part of the equipment as well. A part called a counterlung removes the carbon dioxide from the exhaled air and allows the diver to rebreathe it. So instead of the air they breathe from their air tanks being released into the water, part of it is captured and recirculated through a process that allows them to basically reuse the air. It lets them dive for longer with less tanks, but it requires extra training to use, like most things with diving. The company that was being sued argued Wes wasn't certified to use the rebreather though, and revealed that Wes was taking Ambien, which is used to treat insomnia, and that he was also taking the narcotic hydrocodone, which is typically used as a painkiller during the dive. A 45-minute video of the dive was caught on camera by what it sounds like is Wes's own body camera that he wore, and that footage was used in court. The overall gist of it showed that Wes lost consciousness during his ascent from 83 feet, and he lost his mouthpiece when he fell unconscious and drowned. I didn't see the video, but the company being sued for about $25 million said that it showed how Wes made many mistakes during the dive and that the warning system on the rebreather was working and that Wes ignored the warnings. According to a report, the company's lawyer said to the jury in court, quote, "It's up to you to determine why he's doing that. Is it because he's impaired? Is it because he's inexperienced?" End quote. And he said that referring to evidence that, I guess, Wes turned off the air. The manufacturing company was cleared of wrongdoing after the jury spent less than 5 hours deliberating in May of 2016. According to an Undercurrent article, under Florida law, Terry and her attorney were liable for $670,000 in defense costs and their own lawyer fees. Wes Skiles is regarded highly in the underwater cinematography world and had a freelance company at the time of his passing. Wes actually also worked with legendary cave diver Agnes Myloka, who I also did an episode on already. I'll link that in the show notes for you to check out if you haven't heard it yet. But the diving world is small, so it shouldn't exactly be a surprise that they worked together and knew each other. But it still was kind of shocking for me to come across that tidbit of information while I was looking into information for this episode. While tragedies like that make Jill wonder if she should be taking the risks that come with cave diving, if it's fair to her family and her friends, knowing that there's so much left to explore keeps pushing her to continue anyway. Swimming through the watery graves of where so many of her friends died doesn't stop her, because, in her own words, humanity needs people willing to keep pushing. It's how we evolve. But her ultimate goal is to be the woman she wishes she had met when she was 10 years old, back when she was growing up in Canada and wanted to be an astronaut, before realizing we knew less about the ocean than we do about space, and pulling her towards diving instead. Giving into fear isn't an option for her, and for many cave divers, like I've mentioned in other episodes, you have to be built different for that lifestyle, and you go into it with this mentality that it may be your last dive, even if you do everything absolutely right. And when that's a regular choice that you make, looking at it from that perspective, as insane as it sounds, as far as this story goes, to keep going back into an iceberg that almost took you out multiple times and might have if you went back the last time, it's no surprise why they made those choices. I'm not saying if it's right or wrong, just that it makes sense. Today, Jill is regarded as one of the world's greatest living cave divers, with various awards under her belt and part of several diving halls of fame. Jill has since been in different documentaries, written various diving guides, including an autobiography about her life called Into the Planet, My Life as a Cave Diver, and has a biopic called Diving into the Darkness, available to stream now. Even James Cameron, the director, said, quote, "More people have walked on the moon than have been to some of the places Jill Heinerth has gone right here on Earth." End quote. Everything I mentioned will be linked in the source material at occurrencepod.com. Go to the show notes for the link if you need it. This is not an ad or anything. I haven't spoken to Jill or anyone on her team at all. I just feel like I should at least mention the different things she's worked on and what she's created for anyone interested in learning more about her or her life so far. Leave your thoughts in the comments and stay safe. See you next Thursday. All sources can be found at occurrencepod.com, which is linked in the show notes, along with any other relevant information.